Firstly, let me express my gratitude towards Inna Volodymyryevna and the organizing committee for this opportunity. It's truly an honor to be here with you to share my thoughts and ideas on this topic. So today, I'm going to raise the problem of social dimensions of practical identity. I would like to speak about the problem of personal identity in analytic tradition and compare analytic approach with Ukrainian philosophical debates on personal identity. Besides, I would like to look at the problem of personal identity through the lens of social philosophy. Erik Erikson noted that the concept of identity is so widely used that it seems to be understandable for everyone without any definitions. In 1997, Stuart Hall also noted the discursive explosion around the issue of personal identity. 10 years later, one of the Ukrainian philosophers, Professor Svetlana Kutsepal, admitted that identity was one of the main issues in Ukrainian learned articles in 1990s. Since that, identity of a person has been studied by many philosophers. There is a very short and non-exhaustive list of them. So you can see their surnames on your screen. And I should add that this list is really constantly growing. Identity is studied, and we can distinguish social, economical, political, cultural, gender, and other kinds and types of identity within numerous approaches, such as psychoanalysis, phenomenology, post-structuralism, communicative philosophy, and so on. One of the most widespread approaches in philosophy is philosophical anthropology, especially developed by Kiev Anthropological School, which is also known as Kiev Weltanschauung School, if we take our Ukrainian context. However, analytic philosophy is not taken into account. That is why I would like to introduce an analytic approach to the problem of personal identity into Ukrainian philosophy, where the issue of identity is also crucial. Ukrainian philosophers tend to characterize the person's identity as crisis-driven, regional, and dual. And I would like to compare analytic tradition of personal identity with the key points of Ukrainian philosophical approach to it. And I would like to propose a possible way to unite these two traditions. Raymond Martin and John Barresi, who provide a comprehensive account of the history of identity, note that the evolution of Western theory about self and personal identity can divide neatly into three periods, into three phases. From Plato to John Locke, from Locke to 1960s, and from the late 1960s to the present. The problem of identity of a person was introduced firstly in ancient Greek philosophy, but it was regarded implicitly as a part of other problems. Personal identity was interpreted as a unity of body and a soul, and this unity persists over time. A person is embodied, and thus a person remains the same or identical. It was a usual idea to interpret the problem of personal identity. The first philosopher who turned this problem into both an explicit and self-sufficient issue was John Locke. In chapter 27 of an essay concerning human understanding, he developed his unsubstantial view on personal identity. John Locke states that a human being and a person, they are two different notions, two different ideas. Thus, they have different principles of identity. A human being is a living creature, an organized body. This principle of identity coincides with the principle of identity of an animal or a plant, just bodily identity, so nothing special. However, a person is a thinking, intelligent, living thing that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places. A person is also a forensic term, appropriating actions and their merit and also belongs only to intelligent agents capable of law and happiness and misery. It means a person is an agent who can perceive, ascribe actions and thoughts, and who can remember them. That's why an agent is accountable for the actions. If a person can attribute actions, a person is self-aware or conscious. And John Locke emphasizes, nothing but consciousness can unite remote existence into the same person. Thus, consciousness becomes the criterion of personal identity. John Locke's conception of personal identity faced severe criticism and rejection for its focus on consciousness and memory as a basis of identity. Joseph Butler and Thomas Reid introduced several critical remarks on the problem of personal identity, for example, circularity of consciousness, which becomes important for such analytic philosophers as Sidney Shoemaker and Paul Grice. Besides, Thomas Reid distinguished identity in general as one type of identity and personal identity as the other type. So they are two different categories. However, they have a lot of in common. According to Thomas Reid, identity in general is a relation between thing which is known to exist at one time and a thing which is known to have existed at another time. So, identity in general is identity across time. Personal identity is similar, but personal identity is a continued existence of that indivisible thing, which I called myself. So that's existence of myself, of the self, which continues over time. In other words, the category of personal identity explains why a person who existed yesterday is the same person who is today, and this person will be the same tomorrow. In 1960s, Paul Grice, Sidney Shoemaker, Bernard Williams, John Perry, and other analytic philosophers developed neo-Lockean view on personal identity. Their primary purpose was to improve the Lockean conception of personal identity using logic and linguistic analysis. Eric Olson states that the problem of personal identity is a question of possible circumstances, when a person existing at one time is identical with or the same as a person existing at another time. According to Harold Noonan, the problem of personal identity over time is a problem of giving an account of the logically necessary and sufficient conditions for a person identified at one time being as the same person as a person identified at another time. Thus, the problem of personal identity is why the self remains the same or identical to itself over time despite the changes. Several key points are essential when discussing personal identity. In analytic philosophy, the primary framework for approaching personal identity is metaphysical. It focuses on fundamental questions such as what is a person or what constitutes personhood. Brian Garrett highlights that asking a question of the form what is an F is always asking a question in ontology. Identity is regarded in strict philosophical sense, according to Joseph Butler. Identity is a relation with a specific formal character. It is one-to-one relation and it doesn't admit degrees. According to David Lewis, personal identity is an equality relating to temporal stages of a person. Personal identity is understood diachronically, temporally, across time. To establish the continuity of person's identity, one must consider two distinct moments in the existence of this person and compare these two stages, these two moments. This analysis obviously needs to rely on a specific descriptive framework. This framework should explain how entities persist through time, through changes. According to David Lewis, there are two basic ways to exist across time. That's endurance and perdurance. Something perdures if it persists by having different temporal parts or stages at different times, though no one part of it is wholly present at one more than, whereas it endures if it persists by being wholly present at one time. Analytic philosophy proposes two descriptive frameworks of persistence, three-dimensional ontology and four-dimensional ontology. Three-dimensional ontology is a classical framework. It describes a person as a whole entity existing at all times. It is holistic and temporal because philosophers who belong to this 3D ontology, they don't see that there is temporal stage in a person, in the being of a person. And three-dimensional ontology usually appeals to the idea of numerical identity or sortal identity. So Erik Erikson's animalism or David Wiggins' philosophy can be treated as an example of three-dimensional ontology. And four-dimensional ontology is mereological, temporal. A person is a collection of temporal parts, or such four-dimensional worm. This term was proposed by Harold Noonan. A person is a continuity of person stages. That's a sequence of stages. And paradoxically, a person is discrete. So it means that sometimes two numerically distinct individuals can be considered as temporal parts of one and the same person. The good example is Nozick's closest continuous theory. For instance, if a person were cloned and the original person died, the clone would be seen as the closest continuer of the original person, so the clone would be identical to the original person. The framework of personal identity needs criteria. And basically, there are two criteria of personal identity, psychological and physical. The idea of criterion was introduced by many philosophers, and the phrase identity criteria tend to be ascribed to John Austin and Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein indeed used the phrase criterion of identity, but in a different sense. So, two basic criteria, psychological and physical. Psychological criterion identifies the continuity of consciousness or psychological processes as the foundation of personal identity. A person persists over time as long as there is a continuity of mental states, such as memories. This perspective is closely associated with John Locke's theory, and physical criterion asserts that the persistence of the same body or brain underlies personal identity. And this approach may involve also biological continuity, such as Erik Olson's animalism. According to Erik Olson, a person is necessarily a biological organism, a human animal, and biological persistence is more important than mental persistence or psychological persistence over time. Derek Parfit was a person who decided to change this paradigm of research. He believed that the debate on personal identity holds more significance for practical philosophy, such as ethics and decision-making, rather than metaphysics. He proposed shifting the focus from identity to special relations of survival and continuity. He admits that it is more essential for a person to survive, that it means to continue on existence over time rather than to persist as an identical entity. Therefore, the notion of personal identity doesn't always matter as formal relation of equality. So, Derek Parfit highlights traditional approaches, and he showed that they really don't work. And his theory made a philosophical community to reconsider the problem of personal identity. That's why practical identity as a new paradigm, a new framework emerged in analytic philosophy. Practical identity as the concept was suggested by Kristen Korsgaard. She's one of the first philosophers to use this notion. This approach is developed due to Carol Rowan, Harry Frankfurt, Michael Bretman, and David Schumacher, and many other philosophers. The framework of practical identity encompasses narrative and normative or ethical approaches to consider personhood and agency. Practical identity differs from metaphysical approach in three key features. The first feature is understanding of a person. The second one is interpretation of the personal identity problem, and the last one is the explanation of how identity persists over time. Practical identity develops functional understanding of a person as an agent. This framework derives from Lockean definition of a person as a forensic term. So, according to Maria Schechtman, Locke can be seen as defining the limits of a person as the limits within which specific questions about responsibility are raised. To be an agent demands self-awareness and actions. Being an agent also means to deliberate from the first point of view, making choices and attributing actions. And therefore, an agent is someone who can act, who can take responsibility, who is aware of his or her own actions. The framework of practical identity emphasizes that identity is a process. It is dynamic. It is connected to agents' actions and moral responsibility. And it is also action-centered because it is based on action attribution. It is gradational and viewed in a societal context by re-identification of past actions. So it is action-centered, as I have already mentioned, because it is based on actions, and a person is someone who can act, and who can act from the first point of view, who can be self-aware of his or her own actions. That idea really aligns with John Locke's notion of a person as a forensic term. And in this paradigm, in this framework, a person who acts also ascribes or attributes actions. So the personal identity is the link between a person and actions. And without identity, there is no sense in self-awareness and there is no responsibility for actions. And to be identical, you need to have the phenomenological unity of consciousness. It is important because a person needs to be able to look and to ascribe, to have a worldview, to ascribe actions, and to deliberate from the first point of view. And to have this unity of consciousness, all beliefs, desires, volitions, motives should be unified into so-called overall rational unity. So usually we call this the self. This is a standpoint from which a person deliberates. Therefore, to be identical over time means to maintain this unity of the self. And practical identity, I also mentioned that it is gradational because this framework really involves degrees. And it is dynamic because the self maintains itself in the constant repetition of the acts and attribution of these acts. Practical identity should be also viewed in societal context because it emerges in society. Carol Rovin thinks that you need to achieve this unified self, overall rational unity. But to do that, an individual, an agent, shall be engaged in special relations. She calls them agency regarding relations. That relation in a social group or within a social group. She thinks that agency regarding relations is crucial for a person to become an agent and really to be a person. So agency regarding relations are the condition of personhood because in these relations, people mutually recognize their agency, their personhood, and they really are afraid to lose this status of being a person. And that's why they continue this agency regarding relations. According to Maria Schechtman, a person is someone who lives as a person. So, what does it mean to live as a person? She believes that to live as a person, you need to belong to cultural infrastructure of personhood. So that's the set of practices and institutions that provides the possibility to different activities that make up the form of life of personhood and your agency. So what kind of activities can be treated as social and cultural infrastructure? Actually, there are a lot of them. For example, religious traditions, institution of punishment, education, technologies, systems of symbolic representation, that's language, actually, system of governance, economies, and so on and so forth. So really, there are a lot of practices, social practices, and all of them are social and cultural institutions. Christine Korsgaard believes that practical identity is the source of our obligation, and obligation is what emerges within a social role. She suggests considering the astonishing but familiar phrase, I could live with myself if I did that. So I couldn't live with myself. She believes that a person might have several practical identities and they all coincide with social roles. And these practical identities, they form a special rules how to behave. And they form special roles, special norms, and they give the descriptions of what is prohibited by our practical identity and what is allowed. And that's why For example, if you're a citizen of a country, you should do according to what your role of a citizen is. So you should obey the law, you should pay taxes, and you should defend your country when it is at war. Within the framework of practical identity, this question of persistence through time can be reframed as how the self retains its unified character while maintaining its numerical identity and unity of the self. Maria Schechtman proposes viewing personal identity as a dynamic process of re-identification. According to this perspective, identity is not something fixed, and it is not the relations between the stages of a person's life. No, that's not like that. The idea of Maria Schechtman is applied to the narrative and the process of reattribution of characterizations of your actions. So you reascribe your characteristics, your traits of character, and something like that. When attributing new actions, agents compare them with the past ones. And this helps to integrate different actions in a sequence, in a narrative. And when we ascribe a new action, we compare it with the previous actions, and in such a way, we reascribe the past actions. So we really remember our past actions, and we once again attribute them to ourselves, and we believe that they really are our actions. So that's how the process of re-identification works. And in such a way, through the constant process of re-identification, reattribution of the actions, a person as an agent persists over time. In Ukrainian, however, this idea, the problem of identity, is viewed from a different perspective. Firstly, I should note that the whole tradition of identity, the term of identity, was influenced by Erik Erikson and his theory, but not only by him. Pragmatic philosophy, symbolic interactionism, and continental philosophical traditions also influenced the development of the identity problem in Ukrainian philosophy. The issue of identity is often approached as identity without identity. So this perspective actually diverges from understanding identity as a formal relation between different stages of a person's life. No, that's not like that. Instead, it aligns with Thomas Reid's notion of identity in general. It emphasizes the broad nature of identity. Identity is the result of identification in social groups. So identity is identification with social role or social group. A person's identity is inherently collective because a person is primarily viewed as a social agent, and it is influenced by social interaction. More importantly, in Ukrainian philosophy, the concept of identity is closely tied to national and ethical ethnical identity. So identity of a person is collective. It is national or ethnical. And such identity is not about temporal dimension of a person, it is also about local dimension. And there was a conception of regional identity, and it was very widespread in sociology. And from sociology, it transmigrated into social philosophy. And social philosophers raised this problem of local dimensions of identity in different contexts. In Ukrainian discourse, identity is claimed to be shaped by culture and grand narratives. That's why a person identity is referred to as socio-cultural and narrative. Historians and philosophers of history often emphasize the role of collective memory in shaping a person's identity. The framework of practical identity also encompasses narrative and cultural dimensions of person. And we have narrative history and the idea of narrative identity as well. Narrative is viewed as a method to organize one's experience as a sequence or as a form to present one's stream of consciousness. But actually, narrative is something that is external. That's the way to shape one's worldview. So, sociocultural identity is described as external, in contrast to personal identity, which is internal. And sociocultural identity is constructed by society. So it means that is the question of identity is not about rational unity or numerical unity of the self. It's about social influence. And this sociocultural identity might be viewed as chosen or even artificial or not genuinely inherent. If social cultural identity provides an external description, it cannot be autonomous and efficacious principle of shaping an agent. It's about legal domains, not about moral domains. And moral dimension is very important to keep this rational unity. Because according to Carol Rowan, practical identity and identity of a person in general is about normative commitment. To be a person is our normative commitment, to be an agent. So we need to compare these two frameworks: practical identity, that is widespread in analytic philosophy, and a sociocultural identity, which is in Ukrainian philosophy. Practical identity, that's personal identity in the societal context. And it's about agents' action attribution. And it's internal. In contrast to it, social cultural identity is about social society and societal context, but it's about re-identification and identification with social groups. And it concerns social rules, social group, social norms, and it's about cultural experience attribution. That's why it's external description. The question is how to unite them. Actually, sociocultural and practical identity can be viewed as two sides of one and the same process. Why is it so? Social-cultural identity sets the rule in society, but personal identity is the way how we receive these rules in society. And they too may be united in the narrative. Narrative has its social aspects. For example, Alasdair MacIntyre notes that a narrative doesn't merely unite experience, it integrates different social practices. Individuals come together to engage in shared practices, which are forms of cooperation with specific goals, histories, and challenges, driving them to improve their activities and complete for certain benefits. Thus, narrative is very important for shaping our identity. Narrative operates at both individual, personal, and societal levels. Individuals frame their life experiences as personal stories, while societies use narratives to construct collective memory and shared meaning. That's why such philosophers in Ukraine as Professor Tatiana Podolska observes that narratives are universal. They are universal methods of constructing social reality. They organize personal and societal experiences over time. They create cohesive plots, and they give actions their meanings. Importantly, narrative fosters dialogical identity, enabling individuals to compare their subjective understanding of the world with external reality and societal norms. Why communicative philosophy is also very important in the debates on personal identity. And very often, Ukrainian scholars, Ukrainian philosophers, tend to appeal to communicative philosophy when they consider personal identity and narrative identity of a person. So there is a term narrative identity. Narrative also facilitates the interaction of this social interaction. And narrative transform external evaluations into personal experiences. So narrative is a bridge, and it helps to interiorize external social influences, social cultural influences. And narrative as a structure, it gives meaning and produce senses to our own personal senses, which were shaped in or within grand narratives in our social roles. So basically, this process, the process of interiorization of social influence due to narrative, is the basic point of how social-cultural identity shape personal identity. If we consider personality through the lens of a social philosophy, and personal identity also influences social-cultural identity, as personal identity is more about personal normative commitment, And without personal identity, social and cultural identity, social cultural identity is devoid of this normative commitment. So that's why I think that these two forms can be viewed together through narrative. So I appreciate your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Helena, thank you so much for your interesting and very discursive presentation. Any questions, any comments?
Maybe I will ask.
Thank you. I'm very glad to see you today with us.
Thank you so much, Olena, for your very interesting and your personal attitude to this problem. I'm interested in question about what do you think is our narrative identity and narrative are they the same? Because you told about Tatiana Podolska, who defended dissertation in the field of this topic, and she says about narrative identity. But you say about narrative as a way, a means, facility for binding, for creation of narrative. It means, can we say that narrative identity and narrative are the same things? Or maybe, what do you mean? Explain, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Actually, I read thesis and learned articles by Tatiana Podolska, and I believe that her viewpoint is was shaped by communicative philosophy. That is great, but from analytic perspective, from the perspective of analytic philosophy, narrative is just a method to shape identity. In a narrative approach, for example, approach which is developed by Maria Schechtman, narrative is the way to be a person. And to be a person means to be identical. So there is no contradiction between narrative identity and personal identity. However, what I mean is as follows. There is identification with social roles. And this tradition is due to psychological influence and pragmatic philosophy. I mean, William James, for example, or Charles Cooley, their works, their books were very influential in basic ideas of how identity work. And later, in 1970s, Henry Tedgefell and Turner, so they too proposed the conception of social identity. And this social identity is basically the identification with social role. So that's an image in our mind due to this image, we place ourselves in society. We tend to believe that we belong to a certain social group. So that's our collective identity. That's our social identity. And sometimes we also tend to believe that we belong to a certain culture. So that's why this identity is social-cultural. But this identity, so our identification with our social groups or social roles, is not personal. Social identities can unite interpersonal identities. So personal identity is the condition of personhood, and social identity is social experience. And we can unite different social experiences in a sequence in our personal identity. So they form a hierarchy, or at least some symbolic interactionists believe that these identities, they form a hierarchical structure of ourself. So basically, personal identity, a person uses narrative to build, to shape personal identity, and personal identity is a condition of personhood, and social identity is a part of our personal identity. So that's why there is no contradiction between saying that there is personal identity and saying that identity is narrative. So personal identity can be viewed as narrative. But it's a bit different approach, a bit different perspective to look at personal identity. One of possible approaches.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Svetlana Balinchenko in our chat. Thank you for the extremely interesting presentation. I suggest a question for the discussion. If we consider identity through agency dilemma, could people be responsible and accountable to their identity if the identity basis is external?
So that's why I was saying about narrative. Social cultural identity is external. So that basically the result of our activity in society, our images, our self-image, self-placement. But personal identity can't be external. It's always internal. Personal identity is our first person point of view, which is shaped through actions. That's our self-awareness. That's what I call myself. So that's our self. And that's why personal identity, viewed from the perspective of analytic philosophy, it can't be external. It is always internal. And as an internal link, it's always about normative commitment. For example, I'll give you an example. Christian Korsgaard, who is a neo-Kantian philosopher, that the idea of person is always moral. A person is always a moral agent. Harry Frankfurt, who thinks that an agent, a person, is someone who has freedom of will, is always a moral agent. So that's why accountability presupposes this idea of a person as a moral agent. So
thank you very much. And I have written another.
Yeah.
If we consider it as a good citizen model, for instance, by Wertheimer and Kahner, responsible, participatory, and justice-oriented. How would you describe identity shift then? For instance, we have some identity shifts when we have social shifts or political shifts or the work context. How would you explain the possibility of the shifts?
Yeah, that's thank you for your question. That's really a dilemma, a certain dilemma, as we should basically think about primary principles. Such philosophers as Christine Korsgaard, once again, she believes that practical identities, they like we shape our personal identity, and we act through the lens of our identity in practical situations, in different practical situations, and this coincides with our social roles. And that's why our practical identities, they are normative, because we tend to be autonomous and efficacious creatures as agents. But here, we should ask oneself, is really, I don't know, maybe national identity, is it real? Is it real or artificially constructed? There is Pavel Shelin, who is a Russian by origin, but who thinks that he is an American philosopher, and he believes that only religious identity is really genuine. The other identities are artificially constructed because we live in grand narratives. So that's why it's always a dilemma to describe these identity shifts. And as for me, I haven't found an answer how we can describe this without any contradictions, without any great contradictions.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dear Christoph Lumer, please, your question.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me here the opportunity to ask a question, and thank you for your brilliant talk. I found very interesting your idea that you differentiated various identities, and I think this is also a conceptual difference, for instance. And therefore, I would like to, if you can confirm that what I say, so that we have, as you said, the basis, which is personal identity. And I think this is a kind of practical identity. So it's perhaps even evolutionary, given by evolution. It's a question of our survival, and which has to do with the question when we act. The person who is that entity I will engage for, I'm caring about, yeah? So I care, of course, more about myself, but therefore I have to know who is myself in the future. And I think that's the origin of practical identity. And then we have something quite different. These are, I think, more idealizations, definitions of who I want to be and what are my important characteristics and things like that. There we have a real big spectrum of various kinds of ideal identities, more psychological. Yeah, you have the religious you mentioned, you have the social, perhaps even professional, and so on. There are many of them. And so we need the first one as the basis for the second. And so the first question would would you subscribe to that view? And the second is really another question which regards the narrative, the role of narrative. If it is so, as I have described the thing, that we have these ideal identities, I ask myself if there is really a role of a narrative here. Because usually we define these ideals as kind of values and so on. So these are perhaps definitions, but narratives usually have a story, a development. And I think that's not necessary for having one of these ideal identities. So this would be a question, why this focusing on narratives and not, for instance, on definitions, as it has been done some decades ago. For instance, social psychology, it was defined as a self-definition. And the question of a narrative is, I think, more recent development. I'm not too happy with it. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, for your two questions. As for the first part, I agree with you completely. We've got a lot of identities: professional, cultural, gender identity, a lot of them, national identity as well. Our identities, especially in psychology, are viewed as self-images. That's true. And basically, this tendency is from, I don't know, maybe William James, who shaped this view. But James, as well as Reed and his predecessors, he said about kind of personal identity of the feeling of myself, which involve my body. So the idea of embodiment, body-mind problem, and all images of myself. The same is in symbolic interactionism. For example, Mead believed that the self of a person has two basic parts, I and me. So I, as this first person perspective, the standpoint from which a person deliberates, and me is my idea of how different people treat me in society, so my self-image. So I is what is interpreted as personal identity, and me is what is social identity, actually. And as for narratives, yeah, I completely agree that it's a kind of recent way to describe identity. Let's take, for example, a good example of Galen Strawson, who is against narrativity as a way to approach identity. He gives an example of diachronical people and episodical people. He says that diachronical people, they are just normal people, and episodical people are also normal people, but they don't have this ability to perceive their life to interpret their life as a story. So they can't make the story, but really they are agents, they are persons, and they are normal, they're okay. Everything is okay with them. And Galen Strawson asks, if there is episodic just these episodical people, then narrative is false. It's not necessary as a method. We don't need a narrative to construct our personal identity. However, David Velleman has got his the opposite view. He thinks that values can be shaped in narrative, and that's the only way to shape values. LSD McIntyre is also a good example of shaping collective values in narrative. So narrative is universal method because it can transmit these external things, external opinions, external views into our internal views. Maybe I don't think that narrative is maybe the best way, but it's possible way. And then the task is to check if narrative is a sufficient condition of a personhood. At least it looks like that this process of keeping and maintaining the self, the unified self in time, it needs a framework which explains how. That's why narrative is important. In metaphysics, we've got a four-dimensional ontology, but a practical identity as this notion, as this framework, so it doesn't coincide with this four-dimensional ontology. That's why we need to look for new methods of description of being the same over time. And narrative is a good way to describe being the same, being identical over time. Maybe it's not the best way, but it is at least possible way, because ethical theories of personal identity, they don't explain how a person is identical. So why a person keeps numerical unity, numerical identity over time. So personal identity is always about time, about temporal dimension. So we need something that explains how. So that's it, basically.
May I quickly respond to your answer? Many thanks for it. And that explains a lot, but I'm not still convinced. Of course, we can tell our story, but usually that is quite, depends on the memory a person has. Could be quite, let's say, fragmented. There are pieces here and there. The more we go into the past, it gets more and more fragmented and so on. But if you speak of the ideal part, it's not only, I think, at least for people who are a bit serious and who are looking for a justification, they cannot say, oh, I acquired that kind of value when I was 20 years old, or things like that. They have to have a justification for it. And then the history, the personal history, biography would not be enough. So that what gives this really value and basis is an ideal would be a justification why this value, why not others. This is independent of the history.
Thank you for this discussion. Please, Yaroslav, your question.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. So I have a short question of clarification about the notion of about the sense in which you use the notion of socio-cultural identity. So basically, so classically, the notion of personal identity is about self-identity, so about the identity or with him or herself, yes? And in this sense, how do you understand the idea of social culture identity? So is it still about the identity of a person with him or herself within certain social and cultural framework, or is it notion of identification or identifying of a person with some social group? I think there are two different meanings of the term can here be. Yeah?
Yeah. Thank you for your question. Actually, that's the second idea of synchronic aspect of identity, of identification within social group or with social group, as personal identity is identity across time, and it's identity of a person to him or herself, to themselves. Social identity is identity between numerically two people, or a person and a group of people. So that's not the same as personal identity. However, our personal identity is influenced by social identity. And social identity, social cultural identity here is a broader concept, and it's necessary for historians, for the philosophers of history, because such ideas as collective memory, narratives, and narrative history, they all are based and appeal to the idea of social identity, of social cultural identity. And personal identity is shaped within within societal context. That's why we need to appeal to a broader concept, to the concept of social cultural or social identity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa, please, your question.
Yes, thank you so much, Olena. I used to be a continental philosopher, and now I'm much more an historian. And it was fascinating for the analytical approach to the. So, and my question goes in a historical direction, of course, or theoretical historical direction. So are you, and in a sense, is in the same direction as Yaroslav asked, because one thing is the sense and the feelings of belonging or the identification, and the other thing is identity. And my first question would be, do you really believe in identities as something so essential in your way of thinking? Because from a historical and sociological point of view, identity is a very, very controversial notion, and we tend to avoid it. And also the idea of collective identity and national identity, which is not only an inclusion, which is necessary to act, but also in the name of, but also it's much more exclusions. And we are thinking much more about what identity discourses are excluding at the moment. So if you consider Amartya Sen, who spoke about multiple identities, or the French philosophers about identity can murder, and so on. So at least very problematic to distinguish social, religious, national, whatever, and to consider if it's something real existent, because you insist about the temporal dimension of personal identity, but that is much more problematic for social groups. I mean, to speak about identity of a social group postulate persistence over time. And if you have persistence over time of a group, is much more problematic than to think about a personal identity. So how do you bring the temporal dimension in the discussion about identity without producing violence, exclusions? And I mean, I'm much more in the German, Italian, and French tradition, and we're seeing what is happening. And as a reaction is to reconsider the emancipatory concept of identity from the 1970s, and to actually tend to dismiss the concept because of the problematic exclusions and rigidity and fixed forms. So it's much more a comment, but it is so interesting for me because it's not the tradition I'm used to about identity.
Thank you for your comment, for your question. Basically, in analytic philosophy, identity is what makes me the same over time, or why I am the same person that existed yesterday, and why I should think, I should consider my today's actions, because I'm sure that the tomorrow's person will be the same me, yeah, the same person as I am today. So that's it. But while studying identity in Ukrainian context, it is always about society. It's always about crisis and about some duality. And that's why I decided to look at this social identity from the point of view of analytic philosophy. And I think that they too are different. I mean, social-cultural identity, social identity, and personal identity. However, when we speak about social philosophy and this tradition of philosophizing, we also need the idea of time. And social identity is or seems to be devoid of this idea of time. And personal identity gives this idea of time. So that's why I decided. But personally, I think that social identity is the place, or this way to treat identity of a person. So that's identity without really identity. So it's not about equality relations of a person to themselves. It's about equality relation of a person with social groups, or similarity. That's not actually the identity. This way to speak about identities creates a lot of speculations. And that's why this problem is so crucial, because it gives a way to manipulate people's ideas. So that's why that's really difficult to analyze social identities.
Thank you. Thank you. Any questions, comments? Today we have a very interesting and fruitful dialogue. Nadia, thank you so much. Please.
Thank you. Really interesting topic. There were many deep philosophical questions. So I want to change our direction with my silly question, with my physical, maybe just really physical questions. Olena, have you considered thought experiments with teleportation or maybe replication? I believe in the advancement of physics, and I reckon that we will soon invent this process. Do you think that identity is transferred between teleported beings, or is it lost with the teleportation pattern and restored in the teleported beings, or are both cases the same?
Yeah, Derek Parfit considered these thought experiments about teleportation. As a fan of Star Trek, he was inspired by this technology, sci-fi technology, and he considered ideas of teleportation. And actually, he through this thought experiment with teleportation, he came to the idea of practical dimension of identity as there is always a gap in the life of a person before teleportation and after teleportation. So no one is sure that these two creatures are the same person. They're not identical numerically, but he suggests to look at continuity of mental states. If these two persons considered to be the same self, if they exist not simultaneously but one after another in the sequence of time, and if they share the same ideas, the same attitudes, the same traits of character, so they can be treated as the same person, but it's not really an identity. And the same example, or very similar example, gives Robert Nozick as well. He suggests to look at the Vienna Circle. The Vienna Circle, he says, let's imagine that the Vienna Circle, the philosophers from the Vienna Circle, they went to America and they started to the US and they started their new Vienna Circle there. So is that the new Vienna Circle existing in America, in the US, the same and identical to the Vienna Circle existed in Vienna? And imagine that at the same time, another group of philosophers or a part of the Vienna Circle went to Turkey and they started the Vienna Circle in Turkey. So there is simultaneously the Vienna Circle in the US and the Vienna Circle in Turkey. So in this case, he says, we've got a numerical distinction. So we've got two continuers. That's why they aren't identical to the Vienna Circle. But if there is only one continuer, for example, the Vienna Circle in the US or the Vienna Circle in Turkey, this one continuer can be treated as the closest continuer, so that the stage in the existence of one person or one thing. So, and as for your question about teleportation, if before teleportation is one person and after teleportation is one person, so this numerical identity is kept, is maintained, then this person is like the same one. But, or at least philosophers believe that this person is identical. But if after teleportation we've got two people instead of one person, then they are completely new people. They are similar to the original person, but they are copies of this person, but not this person. Well, that's basically the answer. I hope that I've answered to your question.
Thank you. Thank you. It
It's
was
really exactly what I want to say, what I want to hear.
any questions, comments? Katerina, please.
I wanted to clear for myself the notion, the word, or maybe expression you pronounced at the end of presentation, your report about artificial identity. Today we had test crime, cybercrime, and a lot of questions were dedicated to artificial intelligence and its how can it could be used in very bad way, and the identity, artificial identity in this aspect today, really real fact. Is it good? Is it a result of analytic philosophy successes? I don't understand, because in fact also people who are engaged in this activity, they are clever and they use contemporary technologies and including philosophical technologies. Okay, maybe I didn't understand what do you mean when you, in your context, you say about artificial identity. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. As for artificial identity, I meant that it's not real, that not real and not genuine to a person. It's not inherent, it's not inborn, it's not natural for this person. And a person can take someone else's identity or just shape a new identity in some social contexts. But as for analytic philosophers, they really developed the idea of artificial intelligence. And actually, some philosophers, Sidney Shoemaker, for example, he tends to believe that we can have a non-human persons. For example, John Locke, in his essay, gives a thought experiment about a clever parrot. So a parrot who can talk and who can understand people and who can remember some things. So this parrot who possess self, this parrot is a person, and Sidney Shoemaker thinks that it is possible that robots, intelligence as well, can be treated, robots, angels, maybe, yeah, artificial intelligence, these creatures can be treated as persons if we can really distinguish that they have their self, so they really have their self. So artificial intelligence is intelligence. It's pre-trained model. It doesn't have self, at least now. So that's why artificial intelligence can be treated as a person. But if we imagine, I don't know, maybe an alien or an angel or a supernatural creature which possesses the first person perspective and the idea of self, memory, for example, this creature can be treated as a person. And therefore, this creature can have personal identity.
Dangerous. Identity, yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all participants of our seminar today. We have a good time for discussion and very interesting and amazing and inspiring topics. And it will be very interesting to think about some comparison between analytical and continental and religious, metaphysical perspective of the problem of identity. And you know that discourse of identity sometimes is not so deep, but stereotypical, are widespread in our discussion today. And I suppose today we have I'm sure that today we have a very, very fruitful, very analytical talk about problem of identity. We adapted to new terms, new names, and new mechanisms of understanding of identity. Thank you so much, Olena. Thank you. Tell me, please, is this preparation to defense of your dissertation now? What? Yeah.
Right. My thesis, PhD thesis, concerns analytic philosophy of personal identity and its dimension. So basically, that's the main idea of my thesis. Not just exactly the same idea, but basically the idea of my PhD thesis.
Yeah. I suppose today you defended your basic thesis successfully in this informal but very kindly debate between colleagues, between good friends, I suppose, and a good member of our seminar. Thank you so much. And next time maybe it will be December. I hope, and we will continue our discussion, and I will think about identity all this month before new seminar. Thank you. We will have a report of our meeting today. We have a YouTube, or not YouTube, but Olena, tell me please more exactly, Mishala, what we have. Pages and special collection of records of all of our seminars. Have a nice evening, have a nice day, have a nice week, and have a nice time for our philosophy, for our identity. Positive and happy identity. Maybe one remark, maybe, I hope, practical situation. I am a member of council in my city administration, City of Literature of UNESCO. You know, Odessa is was adopted as a city of cultural heritage. and it was created City of Literature. And with the head of this department, poet, translator from Japan, and Maya Demirli, she proposed me to observe grant application, many European and Asian and many city of the world, how to be the city of UNESCO, the city of literature of UNESCO, because it's a competition. And in one proposal from, I remember, from Swedish city, one of the Swedish city, such as a event, as some workshops and different kind of festivals about narrative medicine as a type of the activity of the City of Literature. And I think about all day long, and it's a very happy coincidence, your presentation about personal identity from the point of view of the narrative. There are many discussions about it, and one of my questions maybe for you, did you involve in your dissertation, in your discussion, approach of Charles Taylor? First of all, he is one of the founder of the theory of self. Yes, I don't know how to translate by English what is the original term. Gerela Sebeta, it was translated. And at the same time, he is founder of the theory of narrative, master, grant, and some levels of narrative. But there are many dimensions of the narrative, and I will think about maybe application of your presentation to understanding of this possibility, what literature is a narrative medicine, and one of the point of this, how to save identity, how to create maybe more positive identity by means not only analytical philosophy, but by the instruments of poetry, literature, and so on. And it will be maybe interesting perspective of the development of your ideas. Thank you so much. It's my comment. It's maybe not necessary to answer. Thank you.
Thank you for this possibility to have a speech here, to attend this seminar, and I'm very grateful for this beautiful inspiration, and that you also gave me such a chance to practice before my thesis defense. That's really what a person, a PhD student, needs: a lot of practice. And that's why I'm very grateful to you and organizing committee, to my colleagues who also asked me to give a good speech, who inspired me. So, and thank you for everything.
Thank you. Continue to our communication. Have a nice evening. Have a nice day. Thank you. Bye.
See you later. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to Olena. Thank you to Ina.
Thank you.
Good luck to Olena.
Thank you.
See you
Goodbye.
soon. Bye bye.